There's something uniquely, viscerally horrifying about hearing the word sewage screamed at a frequency that could shatter high-end patio glass, especially when it's coming from a woman standing in a leopard print swimsuit, clutching your garden hose like it just transformed into a rattlesnake. Right now, as I stand on my porch with a steaming cup of coffee and the county's water violation hotline on speaker, watching a hazmat team in bright yellow suits descend upon the house next door, I realize that suburban warfare doesn't start with a gunshot. It starts with a utility bill. You see, I always thought of Willow Lane as the kind of place where the biggest drama was whose golden retriever barked at the mailman. But that was before I met Karen Mitchell, the 5-year reigning monarch of our HOA, a woman who treats the neighborhood bylaws like they were handed down on stone tablets, and herself like the high priestess of property values. It began with a humble, slightly too thick envelope from the Willow Lane Utility District, and I remember peeling it open with one hand while taking a casual sip of my morning roast, fully expecting my usual $45 and some change. But when I saw the number, I nearly inhaled my drink. $312. For water. I live alone, I don't own a hot tub, and the closest I get to serious landscaping is occasionally spraying the driveway when the squirrels get too bold, yet here I was being billed like I was running a clandestine water park out of my backyard. I checked for leaks, I checked the toilets, I checked my sanity, but the next month it hit 340, and the month after that, it was 368. A slow, steady bleeding of my bank account that felt like a tick digging in for the summer. That's when I started watching, not like a stalker, but just lingering by the window when the evening air cools and the neighborhood rituals begin, and that's when I saw her. Karen was leaning over my side fence, the one that connects our lots via a narrow alleyway, and she was tugging my garden hose through a gap in the boards with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 100 times before. I watched, frozen in a mix of confusion and rising heat, as the green belly of my hose slithered under the fence like a stolen limb, disappearing into her yard. And then it clicked. The pool. Karen had installed this Olympic blue, obnoxiously oversized oasis last spring, trimmed in faux Mediterranean tile that she claimed blended with a natural aesthetic, which was really just HOA speak for, it makes my lawn look like a set piece from a Real Housewives reunion. The city was enforcing drought restrictions, meaning no one could fill a pool without a mountain of permits and a massive surcharge. But why bother with the law when you can just siphon off the neighbor's faucet like a mosquito with a platinum card? The next day, I didn't go to her door. I went to my garage and pulled out the high-end infrared trail camera I usually use for deer tracking, tucked it deep behind the hydrangeas by the spigot, and waited. 2 mornings later, I had the footage. 6 a.m., Karen in a silk robe and oversized sunglasses, looking like a suburban spy, turning on my water and feeding her chlorinated baby with my money. I try to be the good neighbor first. I really did, because I'm the kind of guy who hates confrontation more than I hate high taxes. I knocked on her door that afternoon, kept my voice low, and asked, very politely, if there had been some mistake with my water line. Karen gave me that tight-lipped, curated HOA smile, the kind that says, I'm pretending to be civil because there might be witnesses, and then she looked me dead in the eye and lied. She blamed the landscapers. She blamed the neighbor's kid who walks dogs. She even suggested maybe my pipes were just old and inefficient. I told her I had footage, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of panic behind those designer lenses, but she recovered instantly, her voice turning oily and sharp. 2 days later, the retaliation began. I woke up to a violation slip taped to my front door. Improper hose storage visible from the street. $75 fine. The hose, mind you, had been coiled neatly on its reel for 6 years without a single complaint, but now it was a visual nuisance. The week after that, it was excessive water usage causing turf overhydration, the irony of which nearly made my head explode, considering she was the one drowning my grass to fill her pool. Then came the noise violation for my bamboo wind chime, a gift from my late mother that had hung on my porch since 2003, now labeled as disruptive tonal irregularity. But the real kicker, the moment I knew I wasn't just dealing with a thief, but a tyrant, was the drone. Every morning at 6:30, just as I poured my first cup of coffee, I'd hear that faint, electric whine, a mechanical cicada hovering just over the branches of my apple tree, its GoPro lens staring down in my yard like a sentient piñata. Karen denied it was hers, of course, suggesting teenagers were to blame, but I'd seen it land in her second-floor window box more than once, folding its wings like a mechanical beetle. She was using the HOA's Security and Aesthetic Surveillance Fund to subsidize a private spy program, all because I dared to ask why my water bill looked like a car payment. By the time my third bill hit nearly $400, I stopped being the nice guy and started being the data guy. I spent a personal day at the county assessor's office, fueled by vending machine coffee and a burning desire for justice, digging through faded maps and scanned municipal documents from the early 70s. And that's when I found the golden ticket. My property, Lot 14B, was never actually annexed into Willow Bend Estates. Back in the day, the original owner, an elderly woman named Ruth, who clearly had a spine made of titanium, refused to join the HOA. She'd insisted on a grandfather clause that stated 14B remained exempt from all HOA bylaws as long as the primary structure wasn't demolished. I sat in that dusty records office and laughed so hard the clerk asked if I was okay. I wasn't just okay. I was legally untouchable. All those citations, the malicious barking complaint against my arthritic golden retriever, the negative energy compost fine, they were all legally void. But I didn't tell her. Not yet. I wanted her to get smugger, bolder, higher on her own supply of suburban dominance, because the higher she climbed on her little power ladder, the farther she'd have to fall. And I was already starting to draft a plan that involved plumbing, surveillance, and a little something I like to call the revenge faucet. I didn't just want to win a legal argument. I wanted to create a memory that would haunt her every time she looked at a swimming pool for the next 20 years. You see, Karen was a creature of ego, a woman who felt entitled not just to the neighborhood's obedience, but to its very resources. And as I watched the latest footage of her pool guy, a sunburned, nervous man named Marcos, brazenly threading my hose through a series of decorative ceramic turtles to hide it, I realized that simple litigation was too good for her. I call my old buddy Cal, a man who knows more about the local sewage and drainage grid than the city engineers do, and as we stood in my backyard looking at the spigot, I asked him if it was possible to create a closed-loop irrigation diversion. Cal looked at me, then at the fence, then back at me with a slow, creeping grin that told me he was fully on board with whatever devious thought was rattling around in my brain. "You're talking about gray water, aren't you?" he asked, and I nodded. Gray water. The murky, soapy, earthy runoff from laundry, showers, and sinks. It's not toxic, not exactly, but it has a specific character. It smells like a locker room towel that's been forgotten in a gym bag for a week. And when it's concentrated, it has the consistency of a thin, fermented soup. I told Cal I wanted to reroute the external spigot, the one Karen treated like her personal wellspring, into my basement's auxiliary drainage line. This was the line that handled the overflow from my washing machine and the heavy-duty laundry sink where I washed Peaches, my dog, after her muddy walks. The beauty of it was the legality. I went to the city office the next morning, wearing my best earnest citizen shirt, and applied for a permit to install a native plant demonstration zone, utilizing a sustainable gray water irrigation system. The clerk, a woman who looked like she'd been bored since the late 90s, stamped the papers without even looking up. By Friday, the trap was set. I had installed a dual-valve fitting with a vacuum breaker, Cal's idea, to make sure nothing ever backflowed into the actual drinking supply, and I'd capped off the portable water to that specific spigot. In its place, the hose was now fed by a reservoir in my basement that captured every gallon of rinse cycle water and shower drainage. I even put up a tiny, bright red sign that said, "Inoan potable. Do not drink," satisfying the bare minimum of safety regulations while knowing full well Karen would ignore it, as she had ignored every other boundary. And then I waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. Karen was busy, apparently, planning what her glossy flyers called the Willow Bend Poolside Social. She'd wedged one into my mailbox Saturday morning. Swimsuits encouraged, mimosas provided, hosted by HOA President Karen Mitchell. It was the ultimate look-at-me event, the coronation of her new Mediterranean oasis. I spent that Saturday mowing my lawn with a peaceful, almost zen-like focus, and as I watched the caterers arrive at her house, I felt a strange sense of calm. The bait was in the water, the sun was hot, and Karen was thirsty for a win. Sunday afternoon arrived, 2 p.m. sharp, and the sound of chatter and clinking glasses began to drift over the fence. From my second-story window, I watched as her landscaper, now wearing a branded Mitchell HOA visor like a loyal soldier, crept down the alley. He looked left, he looked right, and then he reached for the green coil of my hose. I sat down at my desk, clicked the record button on my cloud sync surveillance feed, and watched as he connected the line to her filtration rig, a high-end monstrosity she'd bought to purify her stolen water. He cranked the valve, and the gray water reservoir in my basement began to drain. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, syrupy burble. At first, the water coming out was just slightly cloudy, but as the agitation for my morning laundry load, mostly muddy towels and dog blankets, hit the line, the color began to shift. It went from a pale gray to a distinct, earthy beige. I walked onto my porch, coffee in hand, and stood there like a spectator at a championship game. I watched Karen, reclining on a leopard print floaty with a mimosa in hand, laughing with Cheryl and the other HOA wives. The first thing that hit them wasn't the sight of the water. It was the smell. A breeze caught the mist coming off the pool's intake valve, and suddenly, the laughter stopped. Karen's husband, Greg, a man who always looked like he was perpetually recovering from a sunburn, stood up and sniffed the air with a confused, wrinkled nose. One of the guests, a woman in an expensive white sundress, leaned over the edge of the pool, peered at the cloudy swirl entering the Olympic blue water, and let out a sound like a startled bird. "Karen, what is that?" The pool's filtration pump made a deep, rattling gurgle like a belch from a giant, and then the smell truly arrived. An overwhelming wave of fermented laundry soap, wet dog, and stagnant shower runoff. It wasn't sewage in the literal sense of a toilet, but in the heat of a 90-degree afternoon, the distinction was lost on everyone. Karen scrambled off her floaty, her face twisting in a mix of horror and confusion, and she did the one thing she shouldn't have done. She picked up the end of the hose to inspect it. She sniffed it, and the look of pure, soul-shattering realization that crossed her face was worth every cent of those $400 bills. "Sewage!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she realized she'd just pumped 3 gallons of earthy runoff in her $50,000 status symbol in front of the entire social circle. Panic erupted. Greg slipped on the wet patio tile, falling like a sack of bricks, while guests began to scramble for their flip-flops, covering their noses with napkins. One teenager actually gagged and shouted, "It smells like a urinal," as he fled toward the side gate. Karen, in a moment of pure hysterical delusion, actually dove back into the pool, maybe to try and block the intake, maybe to prove it wasn't that bad. But she surfaced seconds later, flailing like a panicked raccoon, screaming that her hair felt filthy. I stood on my porch, took a long, slow sip of my coffee, and watched the hazmat team arrive 15 minutes later. Someone called 911 reporting a biohazard leak. Seeing those men in yellow suits, breathing masks, and rubber boots treading across Karen's Mediterranean tiles was a cinematic masterpiece. They blocked off the yard with yellow caution tape, sealed the pool, and began taking samples. Karen was sitting under a blanket on her lawn, sobbing, while EMTs checked her blood pressure. Her reign wasn't just over. It was being decontaminated. But the real work was just beginning. While the neighborhood was distracted by the yellow suits and the stench, I was preparing for the emergency HOA meeting I knew would be called within 24 hours. I had my milk crate full of binders, my USB sticks, and the zoning documents that proved I was legally a ghost in their system. I knew Karen would try to frame me as a terrorist, a malicious saboteur, but what she didn't realize was that I had the one thing she never respected: the facts. And in the world of suburban politics, the person with the most documentation is the one who survives. The Willow Bend Community Recreation Center smelled like a mix of industrial floor wax and collective anxiety when I walked in for the emergency meeting. This wasn't the usual gathering where people argued over the font size on street signs or the specific shade of beige allowed for garage doors. This was a tribunal. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by Greg and Cheryl, her loyal lieutenant of lawn gnomes, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Her skin was pale, her eyes were bloodshot, and she was clutching a designer water bottle as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this dimension. The room was packed, standing room only, filled with neighbors who had spent the last 24 hours watching the sewer pool video go viral on every local Facebook group. I didn't say a word. I just walked to the front, dropped my milk crate onto the table with a heavy, satisfying thud, and plugged my laptop into the projector. The room went silent as the screen flickered to life, showing the first slide. Exhibit A. Authorized water usage. I didn't lead with the sewage. I led with the theft. I played the high-definition footage of Karen's landscaper sneaking across my property line, the infrared clips of Karen herself in her silk robe fiddling with my spigot at 6 a.m., and the drone shots that she thought were private. Gasps rippled through the audience. I showed the utility bills, the jump from $45 to nearly $400, and then I showed the city records I'd requested. Karen's house, with its massive, sparkling pool, had reported the lowest water usage in the entire neighborhood for 6 straight months. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Mr. Bennett, the HOA vice president, stammered, looking at Karen with a mix of pity and disgust. "This is serious. But what about the contamination? Karen claims you poison her guests." I clicked to the next slide. Exhibit B. Municipal zoning and grandfather clauses. I explained, with the calm precision of a man who had done his homework, that my property was legally exempt from HOA authority. I read the 1973 clause aloud, the one that made me a ghost in their system. Then I pulled out my city-approved plumbing permits. I showed the board that the water line in question had been legally converted to a non-potable gray water system for my native plant zone. I pointed to the red NON-potable sign I'd installed, the one Karen's own landscaper had to reach past to grab the hose. "I didn't pump anything into her pool," I said, looking Karen dead in the eye for the first time. "She stole a hose connected to a clearly marked drainage line on a property she has no jurisdiction over. If you trespass into a house and drink from the mop bucket, you don't get to sue the owner for the taste of the floor cleaner." The silence that followed was heavy, profound, and absolutely glorious. Martha Jenkins, the board treasurer who had been silenced by Karen for years, stood up and asked the question that finally broke the dam. If Karen was stealing water from Mr. Bennett, where else was our HOA budget going? That was the final blow. I flipped to the last set of slides. The financial archaeology Cal sister had helped me dig up. I showed $48,000 of general maintenance funds that had been surreptitiously reallocated to landscape enhancement at Karen's specific address. The pool wasn't just filled with stolen water. It was built with stolen dues. The meeting didn't just end. It erupted. Karen was removed as president by a unanimous, shouting vote before the vice president could even finish his sentence. The board froze all discretionary funds linked to her property, and the fire marshal, who was standing in the back, stepped forward to announce that her pool was being permanently decommissioned as a biohazard until she paid for a full municipal line flush. I walked out of that center feeling lighter than I had in months. The next morning, a hazmat crew returned to Karen's yard to begin the multi-thousand-dollar cleanup she'd have to pay for out of pocket. 3 days later, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard. A week after that, it was joined by a price-reduced sticker. I didn't see her leave, but I heard the moving truck in the middle of the night. A quiet, shameful exit for a woman who once thought she owned the very air we breathed. Today, Willow Lane is actually quiet. The drone is gone. The fines have been wiped from my record, and I've replaced the revenge faucet with a small, elegant stone fountain. It runs on a recycled loop of clean, permitted water, and it gurgles softly every afternoon while I sit on my porch with Peaches. It's a peaceful sound, but every now and then, when the wind blows just right, it reminds me of a very important lesson in suburban physics. What you take from your neighbors always has a way of flowing back to you. So, I have to ask, did the punishment fit the crime? Was I a malicious neighbor for letting her pump the gray water? Or did she bring that stinky situation on herself by ignoring every rule in the book? Have any of you dealt with an HOA president who thought the rules didn't apply to them? Tell me your most insane HOA or neighbor horror stories in the comments below. Let's see who really has the worst Karen on the block.